Okay, Eli Rosenberg, the KMBC 9 correspondent, thank you for joining us there, and a good night and a peaceful night, hopefully, there in Ferguson. And moving on, we're going to central London, where a central London supermarket chain, the branch manager decided to empty the kosher food section, fearing violence from protesters who were gathered outside calling for a boycott on Israeli goods. The Holborn branch of Sainsbury's has since apologized for removing the kosher food from its shelves after it instigated an outrage on social media. To hear more about it, we're joined via Skype from London by our i24 news correspondent there, Jonathan Sacerdoti. Jonathan, thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Neil.
We're going to take a look quickly at the next recorded conversation you had with Sainsbury's, but quickly, just give us the timeline of the events as you know it.
Well, on Saturday, a Twitter user called Colin J. Appleby posted pictures that he'd taken of the kosher goods chiller cabinet in the Holborn branch of Sainsbury's, where he said there was absolutely nothing on the shelves, and he put this picture up for all to see. So, of course, this prompted people to worry why they were removing these kosher goods, and I decided to give the Sainsbury's customer careline a call to find out what was behind the decision.
Okay, let's take now a look at this conversation that you had with a Sainsbury representative regarding the removal of the kosher food from their shelves.
How can I help you?
Hi, I'm just calling to inquire about your kosher section in the Holborn store, which I understand is completely empty of products.
No, it's not.
Well, I've seen photographic evidence that it is. Is there any...
There was a problem yesterday. There was one store in particular that decided to take off the kosher products because there was going to be a bit of a... Oh, I'm trying to think of the word. That's terrible. My mind just went blank. Somebody was going to try and cause an obstruction in the store. So rather than people come into the store and take kosher products off the shelf and whatever, the manager decided to shelf them, put them away until later on, and I can assure you they are all back out on the shelves and in the freezers.
Why is it considered a good reaction to remove products of interest to Jews from the shelves when there's going to be some sort of violent intervention, rather than to stop the violent intervention?
Anything like that, we certainly don't agree with anything like that, but at the same time we can't have anybody going into the stores and pulling stuff and throwing stuff about a shop floor. So
why don't you stop them doing that? If I told you I was going to go into the store and start trashing halal products from the shelves, would you remove them all?
Of course not, sir. As I say,
but that's what you did with the kosher products.
This was one store that decided to do that with the store manager, and it has all been rectified now.
So, Jonathan, we have been speaking about it in the past few weeks throughout Operation Protective Edge of this fine line between anti-Zionism in Israel and anti-Semitism. Corresponding kosher food with Israel obviously is crossing a line.
Of course, kosher food is not Israeli. Kosher food is food that meets the dietary requirements of observant Jews. And that's why people in the United Kingdom, especially the Jewish community, are distressed to see decisions like this, even if they're one-offs taken by one store manager in one branch of a very large chain like Sainsbury's. And you heard there in the phone call, which went on for a further few minutes, about 7 minutes in all, that there was a reluctance to apologize at first for this activity. There was a reluctance to admit that it was a mistake. And eventually the declaration was made that this was not a Sainsbury's-wide policy, that it was somehow an activity chosen so that it would save the chilled goods in case they were thrown off the shelves, and they would have had to have been destroyed according to safety regulations. But what is really worrying people here, and the columnist in the Telegraph website here, Brendan O'Neill, put it very well, is that this sort of acquiescence to bullying from violent crowds who are threatening a store like Sainsbury's is very threatening to the Jewish community, because even if the decision by Sainsbury's is not an anti-Semitic one, it's one that has an effect on the Jewish community, and that shouldn't be happening regardless of what people think about what's going on between Israel and Gaza.
Have you heard from the protesters themselves? Have they made any kind of reaction or set out any kind of response following your call to the Sainsbury representative?
I've not heard from anyone personally. In fact, the coverage that this has been getting has been rather surprising to me. It's gone viral, let's say, across much of Europe. And I can see that people are reporting on this phone call because, as I said, this rising anti-Semitism that's taking place here in the United Kingdom and, of course, across mainland Europe as well is such that people are very afraid. And when you hear individual cases like this, they don't necessarily point to policy decisions of a large store like Sainsbury's, but they do illustrate the many things that Jews in the community are feeling daily, are affecting their lives, which are somehow punishing them for perceived wrongdoings that this virulent anti-Israel crowd across Europe, which is often manifesting itself in violent ways, they're feeling these effects. And the fact of that is that there's a very unpleasant truth which that anti-Israel protesting group needs to acknowledge as well, which is that within it there is a large group of anti-Semitic influenced activity. To target kosher goods in a shop or to even make the shop feel that you're targeting those goods is a problem. And there is something lying behind this undue prominence, this undue obsession with Israel that these crowds marauding across Europe are exercising. And that's, I think, what's making people very afraid here.
And you mentioned that these are lone incidents that have happened quite frequently throughout the operation, not only in the UK, but across Europe. The question is the Jewish community now in the UK going to take perhaps the initiative to prevent more of these cases, or is it still on a more of a defensive? We're waiting for these cases to happen and then we act.
It's a good point. In the Jewish Chronicle newspaper, a weekly Jewish newspaper that comes out here in Britain, there was a full-page advert taken out anonymously with an open letter to the so-called Jewish community leadership, criticizing them for their complete inaction in the face of this enormous rise in anti-Semitism. And that's the other part of the problem. The Jewish community at large feels very much like nobody is looking after it. There's a sense that the police and the government are not taking action when there is violent activity against Jews or against Jewish properties. And there is a sense that the Jewish leadership itself is not living up to its obligations and it's not protecting Jews. It's not being vocal enough with government and with the police, insisting that Jews should be protected. Of course, if Jews don't feel they're being protected by the government and the police, and if Jews don't feel that their own leadership is looking after them, then they start to wonder what future there can be for them in this country and in Europe in general. And that's why we see statistics from polls showing that a huge number of Jews, a very large portion of the Jewish community, is thinking about its future in the country very seriously.
And we, of course, will be continuing to follow the story through you and your reporting. Thank you for joining us, Jonathan Sacerdoti from London. With me again is Anthony Grant. You're here with some headlines from the web.